You may believe yourself to be a hospitable creature, raised in traditions that exalt kindness to the stranger. And you may indeed have acted countless times out of courtesy, preparing food, arranging chairs, and opening your door to those who wish to enter. And yet, somewhere hidden, somewhere beneath the polished surface of manners, there is a resentment, a subtle irritation, a tightening in the chest when the knock comes and the threshold is crossed. Why? You ask yourself, do I secretly hate guests? Why does the presence of the other disturb me when my conscious mind insists that I should welcome them? This paradox, this psychic contradiction, is not trivial. It is a portal into the depths of the human soul, where the archetypes dwell and where the unconscious speaks in its ancient tongue. When we invite someone into our home, we are not merely offering them a chair and a cup of tea. We are inviting them into the psychic territory of our inner world. The home is more than walls and roofs. It is a symbolic extension of the ego, a fortress that protects us from chaos, a temple in which our most fragile order is maintained. The guest is an intruder into this sanctuary. Whether we consciously wish it or not, their footsteps echo not only on the floorboards, but in the deeper caverns of the psyche. They stir archetypal patterns that are far older than any personal history. The tension you feel is the echo of humanity's ancient struggle with the stranger at the gate. In myth, the guest often appears as both gift and threat. In Homer's Odyssey, hospitality was a sacred law, but it was also the gateway through which chaos entered. To accept a stranger was to risk poison, deception, invasion. To refuse a stranger was to offend the gods. This double bind lives in us still. On one hand, we desire to appear generous, moral, belonging to the human family. On the other hand, our instincts whisper that every outsider carries a shadow, and that shadow might contaminate our fragile world. The unconscious is never fooled by social conventions. It knows that every guest is both Hermes, the divine messenger, and the trickster, the thief of peace. You feel discomfort because the arrival of a guest unsettles your carefully constructed persona. The persona, that mask you wear before the world, arranges itself according to your private rhythm. Within your solitude, you are the master. Your slippers are left here. Your books lie open there. Your own breath dictates the tempo. But when a guest arrives, suddenly you must rearrange your persona to fit their gaze. You must smile when you do not feel like smiling. You must listen when you wish to be silent. You must share space when your soul cries for withdrawal. This demand for adaptation awakens the resentment, for the guest threatens the autonomy of the ego. The mask stiffens under the pressure of another's eyes, and you feel betrayed by your own facade. But let us go deeper. Why does the unconscious bristle at the intrusion of another? Because every guest is a mirror, and a mirror reflects not only your politeness, but your shadow. A guest sees the dust in your corners, the disorder you had forgotten, They notice the weariness in your eyes, the dissonance in your laughter. Their very presence illuminates what you would rather keep in darkness. This is why the unconscious reacts with hostility. It is not the person themselves you hate. It is the confrontation with the unlived life within you that they stir. Imagine the dream in which a stranger enters your house. Psychoanalysis has long known that the house is a symbol of the psyche. The cellar is the unconscious. The attic is the intellect. The bedroom is the intimate life, and the kitchen is the transformative hearth. When in dream a stranger enters your house, you are encountering the part of yourself that you have not yet integrated. The dream figure may be shabby, grotesque, or irritating, yet it is your own soul knocking. The same dynamic unfolds in waking life. The guest at your table is an externalized dream figure. Their arrival disturbs you because they constellate within you an unloved, unacknowledged part of your being. Thus, the hostility you feel is the hostility toward yourself. There is also the archetype of territory. Animals mark their territory with scent, humans with walls, doors, locks, and routines. Territory is the externalized ego. To cross into it without invitation is to assault the integrity of the self. But even when the invitation is freely given, there is always the hidden ambivalence. The ego resents the demand for permeability. We wish to appear generous, yet we guard our space like wolves. The contradiction is inevitable, for the archetype is older than morality. The secret hatred of guests is therefore not merely personal neurosis. It is an echo of evolutionary memory, a psychic residue of the tribe protecting its fire. Consider also the archetype of the threshold. Every guest stands upon the threshold of your home, and the threshold is a symbolic line between order and chaos, between the known and the unknown. To open the door is to allow the unknown to pass into the known. This is always dangerous. Myth tells us that demons must be invited to cross a threshold that vampires cannot enter unless welcomed. Why? Because the psyche intuits that to let the stranger in is to let the unconscious flood into consciousness. Hospitality is therefore always ambivalent. It is both sacred and perilous. An initiation into the mystery of the other. You hate guests because they force you into initiation when you would rather remain undisturbed. But there is more. Let us not forget the archetype of the self, the central mystery of the psyche. The self seeks wholeness, and wholeness can only be attained when the opposites are reconciled. The guest is one such opposite. The not, me, the foreign, the shadow bearer. Your resentment toward the guest is the resistance of the ego to the demand of the self. The self whispers, integrate the stranger. Welcome the unknown. Allow transformation. The ego protests, but I want to remain sovereign. This tension is painful, and the pain manifests as hostility, as secret hatred. Yet if you could see with the eyes of the self, you would recognize the guest as an emissary of wholeness, an angel in disguise, even when their presence irritates you. Dreams often portray guests as unexpected intrusions. Perhaps you dream that relatives have arrived unannounced, and you scramble to hide your disarray, or strangers enter your living room and you feel exposed. These dreams mirror the waking resentment. They are the soul's commentary on the fragility of the persona. The guest in the dream is the content of the unconscious demanding recognition. The dream insists you must make room for what you have rejected. You cannot barricade yourself forever. The unconscious will break through, disguised as a visitor. Notice also the paradox of modern life. We long for connection, yet we recoil from contact. We complain of loneliness, yet we resent the guest. This paradox is rooted in the duality of the psyche, the need for communion and the need for solitude. Both are archetypal, both must be honored. When one dominates, neurosis, the secret hatred of guests reveals an imbalance. Perhaps you have sacrificed too much solitude for the demands of society, and the soul revolts. Or perhaps you have barricaded yourself so thoroughly that the guest threatens to dismantle your sterile isolation. In either case, the unconscious speaks through resentment. It says, attend to your balance. Do not betray either solitude or communion. Now let me take you into the symbolic image of the banquet. In many myths, the banquet is the scene where strangers are invited, where heroes reveal themselves, where betrayals occur. To sit at a table with others is to enter communion, but also rivalry. Food is life, and to share it is to risk contamination. The guest takes from your table, consumes your bread, drinks your wine. This evokes the archaic fear of scarcity, the anxiety that there will not be enough for you. Thus the unconscious reacts with hostility. They are devouring my life force. The hostility may be irrational in modern abundance, but archetypes do not vanish because refrigerators are full. They whisper from the depths, ancient voices reminding you of famine, invasion, hunger. The secret hatred is the echo of these ancestral fears, and yet the very discomfort points to the possibility of transformation. For what we hate secretly often conceals the treasure we need. The guest is a shadow figure. Yes, but the shadow always carries gold as well as poison. To welcome the guest consciously is to perform an alchemical act. You are dissolving the rigid walls of the ego, allowing the opposites to mingle. The irritation you feel is the heat of transformation. In alchemy, one must endure the nigredo, the blackening, before the gold appears. The guest is your nigredo. You would prefer to avoid it, but without it, there is no wholeness. If you pay attention to your resentment, you will hear its symbolic language. It says, I fear exposure. I fear contamination. I fear being devoured. I fear losing my sovereignty. These are not merely social discomforts. They are primal fears, archetypal anxieties. They point to the core struggle of human existence, The balance between the self and the other, between solitude and communion, between order and chaos. To secretly hate guests is therefore to wrestle with the mystery of being human. If you deny the hatred, it festers in shadow, poisoning your hospitality with passive aggression. If you confront it, you may discover in it the path to deeper self-knowledge. Thus, when the doorbell rings and you feel that tightening in your chest, do not merely scold yourself for being inhospitable. Instead, listen. Ask, what part of myself does this guest represent? What unloved figure is entering my house in their form? What ancient fear is being awakened? In this way, the guest becomes a teacher. The resentment becomes a symbol, and the house becomes a temple of transformation. You may still dislike their presence, but you will no longer be enslaved by the unconscious hostility. You will know that within your hatred lies the seed of wholeness. We must now enter another chamber of the psyche, where the image of the guest takes on more sinister contours, for the guest is never only the neighbor or the friend. The guest is also the archetypal other, the figure of alterity itself, the embodiment of all that you are not, and it is this archetypal dimension that stirs the deepest ambivalence. You may welcome your neighbor because politeness compels you, but your unconscious recognizes in them the ancient figure of the intruder, the invader, the one who arrives unbidden to test your sovereignty. When the unconscious whispers its protest, you feel the tightening in your chest, the restless desire to reclaim solitude. You tell yourself you are tired, that you are introverted, that you simply prefer quiet. But behind these rationalizations lies the archetypal truth. The ego hates to be unsettled by the archetype of the other. This is why hospitality is so sacred in myth and religion. Hospitality is not merely politeness, it is an encounter with the gods. In the ancient world, the stranger might be Zeus in disguise, or an angel sent to test you. To refuse the guest was to risk divine punishment. But to accept them was to risk ruin, for the guest could as easily be a trickster or a destroyer. This double aspect still haunts the modern soul. You offer tea, but you wonder secretly, what disruption will this guest bring? What part of my fragile equilibrium will they unravel? The ambivalence is profound because the archetype itself is double. The guest is both blessing and curse, both angel and demon, and your unconscious feels both at once. Even when your conscious persona insists upon smiling, the phenomenon is heightened when the guest is uninvited, when they arrive suddenly and demand your attention. Here, the archetypal image of invasion is constellated. The uninvited guest is like a dream figure who breaks into your house at night, a symptom of unconscious contents erupting into consciousness without your permission. You feel violated, not because the person themselves is cruel, but because they embody the eruption of the unconscious into your carefully guarded order. Every psyche fears such eruptions. We all desire to control the timing and manner of our encounters with the unconscious. but the unconscious refuses to be scheduled. It bursts forth like a guest arriving at the wrong hour. Your secret hatred is a soul's protest against the uncontrollability of life. There is also the shadow of envy. Every guest carries with them their own world, their own way of being, their own secret harmony or disharmony. To host a guest is to confront the differences between your life and theirs. If they are successful, you are reminded of your failures. If they are cheerful, you are reminded of your melancholy. If they are at ease, you are reminded of your tension. Thus, resentment grows. The guest becomes a mirror, reflecting not only your dust but your wounds. It is easier to project hostility onto them than to acknowledge the ache of inadequacy they awaken. And so you say to yourself, I wish they would leave. When in truth you mean, I wish I did not have to see this wound inside me. And let us descend further. The unconscious carries images older than our civilization. Among these are images of the feast disrupted by the stranger, of the fire stolen by the outsider, of the camp raided by another tribe. In our evolutionary past, the guest was never neutral. They were a potential ally or potential enemy. Suspicion was survival. Hospitality was dangerous. Generosity, this memory has not vanished. It sleeps in the collective unconscious. When your guest opens your refrigerator and pours themselves a drink, something archaic stirs in you. They are consuming my life force. They are taking what is mine. You may laugh at the irrationality of the thought, but your nervous system does not laugh. It reacts as though the ancestral enemy were at your table. This is why resentment feels so visceral, so bodily. The body remembers what the mind forgets. At this point, you may protest, but I love my friends. I enjoy their company. And yes, this is also true, for the archetype is double. As I have said, the guest is both threat and gift. The ambivalence is irreducible. You love them and you hate them. You desire them and you repel them. Such contradictions are not to be solved, but to be endured. The psyche thrives on tension. When you suppress one pole, you fall into neurosis. When you acknowledge both, you become whole. To admit that you secretly hate guests is to embrace one pole of the tension. To admit that you also long for communion is to embrace the other. Between these opposites, transformation takes place. The alchemists knew this. Solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. The guest dissolves your ego's order. And in the discomfort, a new order may coagulate. Now let me show you another image. The dream of the banquet hall filled with faceless strangers. Many analysons have brought me such dreams. They wander among tables where countless guests are seated, none of whom they know, yet all of whom stare at them with strange intensity. This dream is the image of the collective unconscious. The faceless guests are archetypes, unlived potentials, forgotten ancestors. The dreamer feels overwhelmed, as though crushed by too much otherness. This is the psyche's commentary on the burden of society, the demand to host countless energies at once, To live consciously is to host many inner guests: the child, the lover, the warrior, the sage, the fool. Each demands attention. Each disrupts the ego's order. The dream of faceless guests shows the magnitude of this demand. It is no wonder we secretly hate guests in waking life. They remind us of the infinite guests within, but do not mistake hatred for evil. Hatred, when acknowledged, is energy. It is the fire of differentiation, the passion with which the ego defends its boundaries. Without this hostility, you would be dissolved into the collective, lost in the sea of others. The hatred of guests is thus partly healthy. It preserves the sanctity of your psychic space. Only when denied does it become destructive, manifesting in passive aggression or self-loathing. The task is not to eliminate hatred, but to transmute it, to recognize its symbolic meaning. The energy of hostility can be transformed into the energy of discernment, the wisdom to know when to open the door and when to keep it closed. Let us recall also the archetype of the hearth. The hearth is the sacred center of the home, the fire around which life gathers. To allow a guest to sit by your hearth is to share your soul's fire. This is no trivial gesture. It is a symbolic communion akin to the Eucharist. The guest partakes of your essence. No wonder you feel resentment. It is as though they sip from your very blood. But here too lies the possibility of transformation, for in sharing your fire, you enact the mystery of sacrifice. You give something of yourself, and in giving you are enlarged. The ego resists, the unconscious resents, but the self whispers that sacrifice is the path to wholeness. Every guest is therefore an invitation to enact sacrifice, to test whether your ego can endure the diminishment that leads to growth. Consider also how guests disrupt time alone. You live in your rhythm, your cycles of rest and activity, but when a guest enters, time is altered. Suddenly, there are conversations when you would be silent, meals when you would fast, wakefulness when you would sleep. The guest forces you into their time, and this too provokes resentment. Time is sacred. It is the structure of the soul's unfolding. To have it disrupted is to feel violated. Yet here again lies a mystery. The guest brings the possibility of kairos, of sacred time, breaking into profane routine. The disruption may be painful, but it may also awaken you from the trance of habit. The guest forces you into a moment you would not have chosen. And in that moment, something new may be born. The ego resents it, but the self rejoices. I recall a patient who dreamed repeatedly of hosting unwelcome guests. In one dream, her house was filled with drunken relatives who would not leave. In another, strangers occupied her bed and she slept on the floor. In waking life, she was polite, accommodating, always available to others, but her dreams revealed the truth. She secretly hated these intrusions. She had repressed her hostility into the unconscious, where it appeared as grotesque guests. Only when she acknowledged her hatred could she begin to set boundaries. And once she did, her waking relationships improved. The dream guests no longer tormented her, for she had learned to honor the energy they symbolized. This is the task, to recognize in the outer guest the reflection of the inner guest, to welcome consciously what the unconscious has long borne with hostility. There is also the figure of the unwanted guest as death itself. In many cultures, death is portrayed as a visitor who knocks at the door, who enters unbidden, who sits at your table, whether you welcome him or not. Every actual guest is therefore a faint reminder of mortality. Their intrusion whispers, one day another guest will come whom you cannot refuse. This archetypal association magnifies resentment. You may not consciously think of death when a neighbor arrives for tea, but unconsciously you feel the disturbance of your order. And order is what death ultimately dissolves. The hatred of guests is therefore also the hatred of impermanence. The resistance to the inevitable guest who one day will occupy your bed. To meditate on this is to see that every guest is a rehearsal for death, an opportunity to practice letting go. Thus we return to the paradox. You hate guests because they unsettle you, and yet in unsettling you, they bring the possibility of growth. To welcome them consciously is to engage in the alchemy of transformation. To resist them blindly is to remain enslaved to unconscious hostility. The task is not to eliminate the feeling, but to see through it, to interpret its symbolic language. Every knock at the door is the psyche calling. Every intrusion is the self-demanding expansion. You may resent it, but if you listen carefully, you will hear beneath the resentment the voice of the archetype, whispering of wholeness. Let us now move more deeply into the psychic labyrinth, for the figure of the guest is not only social and archetypal, it is profoundly intimate. The guest awakens in you a confrontation with boundaries, and boundaries are always about the question of identity. Who am I when another steps into my space? Who am I when my solitude is interrupted by the presence of a foreign rhythm, another will, another set of desires? The ego, fragile in its claim of sovereignty, feels immediately destabilized. It wishes to believe it is the ruler of its small kingdom, but the guest reveals that the kingdom is porous, that its walls can be breached, that sovereignty is never absolute. This revelation provokes anger, even if it is masked by smiles, and thus the hatred emerges, cured, hidden, but unmistakable in the body. The body does not lie. You feel it in the quickened pulse, the stiffness of shoulders, the heaviness of breath. The guest triggers the nervous system, and behind that reaction lies the unconscious memory of countless disruptions of childhood, when you were not allowed to retreat into yourself, of family gatherings where you were forced into false cheer, of visits where you felt observed, judged, or suffocated. Every guest carries with them the ghost of those earlier visitors. The unconscious does not differentiate between now and then. It responds to the archetype And the archetype of the guest contains all who have ever entered, welcome or unwelcome, kind or cruel. To hate a guest in the present is therefore often to hate the ghost of past intrusions. The figures who once trespassed against your soul. We must not forget that many people carry within them a wounded inner child who longs for a private sanctuary that was never granted. If as a child you were forced to entertain adults when you wished to play alone, or to smile when you felt sorrow, or to share your toys when you desired to keep them, then the arrival of a guest today awakens that old wound. The hatred you feel is the child's protest, the echo of a voice that was silenced long ago. The guest becomes the symbolic parent who demands compliance, and your body remembers even if your conscious mind cannot. This is why the hatred can feel disproportionate, as though larger than the situation warrants. It is the flood of the past, surging through the present moment. But let us not linger only on personal wounds. The archetypal depth goes further. The guest is also the figure of the unconscious content that intrudes into consciousness, demanding recognition. The psyche is like a house filled with many rooms, some of which you prefer never to enter. These rooms are sealed, their doors locked, their lights extinguished. But the unconscious does not respect locks. It sends figures up from the cellar and down from the attic. They appear as dreams, as moods, as strange thoughts, and they appear as projections upon others. The guest who enters your home is not merely themselves. They are the projected image of what you repress. Their presence insists that you face what you have hidden. To hate them is therefore to hate the reminder of your own hidden self in myths and fairy tales. We often find the motif of the uninvited guest at the feast. Think of Sleeping Beauty, where the 13th fairy is excluded and she crashes the celebration with a curse. This image is profound. It teaches that to exclude any part of the psyche is to risk its return in destructive form. The uninvited guest is always the repressed content. When they appear, we feel hatred because they represent the very thing we try to banish. Yet their curse is the gift of individuation, for without their disturbance, the soul would never awaken. The guest you secretly hate may indeed be your 13th fairy, bearing both curse and blessing. If you can receive them consciously, their curse becomes initiation. There is also the archetype of the intruder as shadow double. In dream analysis, strangers often represent aspects of the shadow, those qualities of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. The shadow is everything we do not wish to be, yet secretly are. When a guest arrives who talks too loudly, eats too much, dominates the room, you may feel hatred rising, but if you examine carefully, you may see that they embody traits you repress in yourself. Perhaps you envy their shamelessness, their vitality, their freedom from restraint, or perhaps you fear that you too are secretly as clumsy, as needy, as demanding. The hatred then is projection, the displacement of your inner conflict. onto the external guest. To recognize this is painful, but liberating. It reveals that your hatred is a mirror, not a judgment. What you despise in them is what you have not yet made peace within yourself. And yet the guest can also embody not only shadow, but anima or animus, the inner contrasexual figure who demands integration. If the guest is of the opposite sex, their presence may stir unconscious desire, fantasies, longings you would prefer to avoid. The irritation you feel may mask a deeper attraction, a trembling recognition that the other carries the key to your unlived potential. The hatred, then, is the defense of the ego against transformation. For to allow the anima or animus into consciousness is to risk upheaval, the reordering of one's psychic life. The guest becomes unbearable because they constellate the archetype of Eros, which is always disruptive, always destabilizing, always demanding more than the ego is willing to give. Hatred here is but a veil over fear of desire. We can also see the guest as a representation of the collective itself. The collective is always knocking at the door of the individual, demanding conformity, demanding participation. Every guest is in some sense an emissary of society, carrying its norms, its expectations, its invisible rules. To receive them is to be reminded of the collective gaze, the surveillance of culture. Many people feel secretly oppressed by this, especially those whose individuation demands solitude. Thus, the hatred of guests is also the hatred of the collective's demand that you be sociable, that you belong, that you offer yourself to its endless appetite. It is the soul's rebellion against assimilation. The guest embodies the demand to play a role, to wear the persona, to surrender authenticity for acceptance. The hatred says, I do not wish to play anymore. I wish to be myself. The alchemists often wrote of the conjunctio, the sacred union of opposites. They knew that transformation requires the meeting of what is foreign. In this sense, the guest is the necessary opposite, the foreign element that can trigger the alchemical process. To secretly hate them is to resist the opus, to refuse the union. And yet, if you can endure the discomfort, if you can allow the foreign element into your vessel, the transformation will occur. The resentment you feel is the fire under the alchemical pot. Without it, the work would remain cold. The guest, then, is your alchemical agent, irritating you into growth. What you call hatred is in fact the heat of transformation. Let us look also at the dreams where the dreamer discovers unknown people living in their house, occupying rooms they did not know existed. These dreams are strikingly common. They reveal the expansion of consciousness, the discovery of psychic spaces previously hidden. The guests in these dreams are not random. They are the soul's inhabitants, the forgotten potentials, the rejected selves. When such dreams occur, the dreamer often feels both fear and resentment. Why are these people here? "This is my house." Yet the truth is that the house was always theirs too. They are parts of you, demanding recognition. The dream images and the waking guests function alike. Both force you to see that your psychic house is larger than you imagined, and that it is not yours alone. Wholeness means sharing. And here lies the crux of the matter. The hatred of guests is the hatred of wholeness. For wholeness is never comfortable. It is not the ego's fantasy of perfect solitude and order. It is the messy, demanding reality of integrating what is foreign. To become whole is to open your door again and again, not because it is pleasant, but because it is necessary. Every guest, whether in dream or in waking life, is an opportunity to practice wholeness. Your secret hatred is the sign that the work is real, that transformation is underway. If you felt only delight, nothing would change. It is the irritation, the discomfort, the hostility that mark the threshold of genuine growth. The guest wounds you, and in the wound lies the medicine. We may also think of Christ's parable of the wedding banquet, where many were invited, but few were chosen. The banquet is the image of the self, the great feast of individuation. To enter, one must wear the proper garment, the garment of consciousness. Guests who arrive improperly clothed are cast out. This myth reminds us that not all guests are to be received blindly. Discernment is essential. To integrate the unconscious does not mean to let every figure run wild in your psyche. It means to test them, to clothe them in meaning, to make them conscious. In the same way, to welcome a guest in life does not mean to surrender your soul. It means to engage consciously, to recognize the archetype at play, to see in their arrival the self's demand for growth. Discernment transforms hatred into understanding, resentment into wisdom. Therefore, when you feel the secret hatred rise, do not condemn yourself as inhospitable. Rather, take it as a sign the psyche is speaking. Something within you resists expansion. Something fears the foreign. Something clings to its small order. The guest has awakened this resistance. That is their gift. If you can hold attention, if you can endure the discomfort without collapsing into hostility or fleeing into politeness, you will grow. The guest is an initiator. They lead you into deeper chambers of yourself, whether you wish it or not. To secretly hate them is to feel the fire of initiation. It burns, yes, but it illuminates. And now we must turn to the most mysterious layer of all, where the guest ceases to be simply a figure of social life or dream image, and is revealed as the archetype of the divine visitor. For there is always in the psyche the possibility that the one who disturbs your order is in truth the messenger of the self, the emissary of what is highest in you. This is why traditions insist that angels come disguised as strangers, why the gods of Olympus wandered the earth in the garments of beggars, why Christ himself said that what you do to the least of these, You do unto me. The ambivalence you feel, the secret hatred, is in part your fear of the sacred, for the sacred is never tame, never comfortable, never under the control of the ego. The divine guest overturns the tables of your inner temple, demanding that you live in truth rather than in illusion. You fear this visitor because they threaten to dissolve your carefully constructed identity. They remind you that you are not complete, that you have not yet faced the fullness of yourself. And so you resist them, even hate them. Yet the hatred conceals a deeper longing, for beneath every irritation lies the cry of the soul. Let me grow, let me expand, let me become whole. The guest who irritates you is the very instrument by which the self pushes you toward individuation. You want to remain in your small circle of comfort, but the self insists on more. It sends guests to your door as trials, as initiations, as catalysts. The secret hatred you feel is the friction between ego and self, between stasis and transformation. Consider the myths of Philemon and Baucis. The poor couple who welcomed the gods disguised as weary travelers. Their hospitality brought them blessing, for the gods revealed themselves and spared the couple from destruction. This story shows that the guest is never merely human. They carry within them the archetype of divinity. To receive them consciously is to receive the God within yourself. To hate them unconsciously is to turn away from your own transformation. Yet even this hatred has meaning. It shows you where your resistance lies, where your ego clings most desperately. To control, to admit, I secretly hate guests, is therefore to confess. I secretly resist my own wholeness. It is an honest beginning. In your dreams, you may notice that the guest often appears in the basement or attic, those liminal spaces of the psyche where repressed contents dwell. Sometimes they arrive as intruders, sometimes as wanderers, sometimes as mysterious guides. If you follow them, you may discover new rooms, hidden staircases, forgotten treasures. The dream suggests that the guest is not only a disruption, but also a guide into unknown dimensions of the psyche. What you hate in waking life may be precisely what would lead you into growth. The secret hatred, then, is the ego's attempt to block the path to discovery. But if you attend to your dreams, you will see that the guest comes again and again until you can no longer ignore their presence. The psyche insists on its wholeness. The self will not rest until all the guests are welcomed. Let us also remember that individuation is not a solitary process. Though solitude is essential, it is always in relation to others that we meet our limits, our projections, our shadows. Without the other, we could remain deceived about ourselves indefinitely. The guest is therefore indispensable. They are the crucible in which our persona cracks, the mirror in which our shadow is revealed, the catalyst by which our ego is humbled. Without guests, we would stagnate in narcissistic isolation. With them, we are forced into confrontation, into discomfort, into transformation. You may secretly hate them, but you also secretly need them. The psyche arranges these encounters because it knows you cannot grow alone. There is one more layer. The guest as the unlived life. Every person you meet carries with them a path you did not take, a life you did not live. Their presence awakens in you the ghost of that possibility. If they are adventurous, you are reminded of your caution. If they are artistic, you are reminded of your practicality. If they are serene, you are reminded of your restlessness. To sit with them is to sit with the ghost of your unlived potential. And this is painful. You feel resentment because their presence exposes what you have sacrificed, what you have left behind. Yet this too is necessary, for individuation requires that you become conscious of your unlived life, that you integrate its energy, even if you cannot walk every path. The guest reminds you of your incompleteness. The hatred you feel is the ache of what might have been. Thus, when you confess that you secretly hate guests, you are speaking a truth that is universal, archetypal, and profoundly human. You are admitting that you resist the intrusion of the other, that you resent the loss of sovereignty, that you fear the mirror of your shadow, that you ache under the weight of your unlived life. There is no shame in this. It is the condition of existence. What matters is not to deny the hatred, but to understand it, to hold it consciously, to see through its symbolic meaning, for in that understanding lies the possibility of transformation. Hatred becomes awareness, awareness becomes compassion, compassion becomes wholeness. The guest remains difficult, but no longer merely irritating. They become a symbol, a messenger, a teacher. And so I say to you, the next time your doorbell rings, pause, notice the tightening in your chest, the fleeting wish that the visitor would vanish. Do not scold yourself for this reaction. Instead, ask, what does this figure represent in me? What archetype is being constellated? What shadow is being stirred? What unlived life is knocking at my door? If you can approach the guest with this symbolic attitude, then even your hatred becomes meaningful. You will see that the guest is never only the guest. They are Hermes, the messenger. They are death, the inevitable. They are the 13th fairy. They are the anima. They are the self. To welcome them consciously is to welcome the fullness of life, even in its discomfort. To hate them unconsciously is to remain trapped in ego's illusion. This, then, is the paradox I leave with you. You secretly hate guests because you secretly fear yourself. Yet in every guest lies the key to yourself. If you can see this, if you can endure the discomfort without fleeing into denial, then every guest becomes a sacrament. Hospitality is no longer mere politeness, but an initiation. The guest disturbs your order, but in doing so, they awaken your soul. And in that awakening lies the great mystery of individuation. That wholeness is not achieved by remaining alone, but by opening the door again and again, even when you would rather keep it shut. For the psyche demands expansion, and the self will not rest until every guest has had their place at the table. So you will continue to feel the secret hatred. You will continue to feel the tightening when the knock comes. But now you will know this hatred is the fire of transformation. It is the sign that the self is at work. Do not despise it. Do not suppress it. Let it burn and let it illuminate. For in the end, every guest is your teacher. And every act of hospitality, even when it hurts, is a step towards the mystery of your wholeness.